The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hey everybody, welcome to the webinar. People are still joining, so we'll get started in a couple of minutes. Hey everybody, welcome to the first of our fall series on systems collaboration, Asset Mapping, a strategy for housing and workforce systems collaboration. Before we get started, I wanted to go over some housekeeping items. All attendees are currently muted, but feel free to use the questions chat box to send a question if you have one. We'll be collecting the questions throughout the webinar, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end. This webinar is being recorded, and video and slides will be made available on our website, and we'll also be sending out the slide deck and the recording through email to all attendees in about a week from today. And finally, we encourage you to join us on Twitter. We'll be live tweeting this using the hashtag SystemsCollabWorks, or you can mention us at Heartland Policy. We have a bunch of amazing speakers today. They are Vanessa Sumanelson, the Director of Learning and Reporting at McGregor Fund, Irene Vidianti, Senior Data Scientist from the County of Los Angeles Chief Information Office, and Dara Papel-Weinger, Senior Program Manager at the Corporation for Supportive Housing. Before we dig in, I'd like to introduce ourselves. Heartland Alliance is a human rights and social services organization that is over 100 years old. We're headquartered in Chicago, Illinois, but we serve people throughout the Midwest, nationally and globally. We provide a continuum of programs, including health, housing, and human care services that address the root causes of poverty and generate social change. Within Heartland Alliance, one initiative that our team works on is the National Center on Employment and Homelessness, or NCEH. Our vision is to ensure that every person experiencing homelessness who wants to work is able to access a quality job. We work with communities across the country on systems change projects, and we also provide policy advocacy, training, technical assistance, and other types of field support, which we'll be talking about in a little bit. So now that we've introduced ourselves a little bit, I'd like to have you all respond to a poll on who is joining us today. I'll launch that now. And if you could respond to which best describes your role, you could choose more than one if your role falls into more than one category. And if anybody's role does not fit into any of these categories, feel free to choose other and explain in the chat. Awesome, still getting some responses in. Cool. So it looks like we have 47% workforce development providers or leaders, 32% homeless service providers, 26% others, 10% government officials, lawmakers, 5% philanthropy. Awesome. So thank you for responding. I will now, and thanks for joining the webinar. I will now pass it over to Chris Warland, who is our Field Support Director, to get us started.
Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. Once again, my name is Chris Warland. I'm Director of Field Support here at Heartland Alliance. And I'm going to kick us off today just by talking a little bit about what we mean by asset mapping. A lot of communities that we've worked in over the years have been a little bit intimidated by this process and by the term itself. And a lot of times communities can feel as if, they're not sure that, that they're doing asset mapping correctly or in the right way or in a way that meets their own needs. And so I just want to put everyone at ease a little bit when it comes to the term asset mapping and what this process can look like. We're calling this asset mapping today, but in fact, it can go by many names. People might refer to asset mapping or resource mapping or network mapping, or might just talk about conducting an inventory of resources in their community, or doing an environmental scan, or any number of other terms. Sometimes I think communities will embark on this kind of work without really calling it anything. But what all of these terms have in common, or how they overlap, is that we're really talking about identifying the resources that are available in a given community to support the population that we're serving. And so in the case of our presentation today, we're talking specifically about resources that are available to people experiencing homelessness, who are seeking work or who would benefit from accessing employment services and earned income. Although a lot of these ideas and techniques might apply equally well to people who have other service needs, or who are accessing different systems. But in our case, we're talking about the resources that are available to job seekers who are experiencing homelessness. And so for our purposes, asset mapping would primarily be looking at the kinds of employment services and other support services that are available in a community for job seekers experiencing homelessness, whether those are resources that are specifically designed and implemented to serve that population and to meet their particular needs, or other services that are available that just incidentally are being accessed by people experiencing homelessness. So that could include, for example, community-based organizations that have a specific mission and are specialized in providing employment services or other supports to people experiencing homelessness, or it may be other community-based organizations that just provide employment services generally, or it may be public systems like public workforce systems that have a mandate to provide employment services to everyone in their community. And of course, everyone includes people experiencing homelessness, and people experiencing homelessness have a right to access those services and to have appropriate, effective services in the same way that everyone else is. So in this case, we're talking about identifying those resources, and also, perhaps performing some kind of assessment to try to determine the capacity of those organizations to provide resources, the quality of resources, what their outcomes might look like, whether or not those services are appropriate for the service population that we're working with, and to try to make some determination about how to best connect people experiencing homelessness to the most appropriate services for them based on their needs, and their proximity to services and how well they're able to access them. And then once you've done this work, and it can take all kinds of different forms, you can do it through survey research, you can do it through interviews, focus groups, you can do it less formally, you can do it more formally, and we have some great examples today about how a couple of different communities have conducted this work. And then the products can look different as well. You could create, for example, a report or a guide that functions as kind of a point-in-time snapshot of what those available services look like. You might try to create a more dynamic product that kind of changes over time. That could be, you know, a database or an automated or semi-automated system to connect people to services based on their needs. And in some cases, it can, in fact, even look like an actual map, although it doesn't have to. But really, in most cases, the objective is to better connect people to services and to make sure that resources are being used efficiently and that people are being connected to the best possible and most appropriate and most effective resources for them based on their individual needs, as opposed to what happens in most communities most of the time, which is, you know, people who are connected to services based on informal connections and relationships among workers in different organizations or systems, or just based on who's most, you know, convenient to those individuals, you know, geographically, you know, when in fact there might be a better way or a more effective way to systematically connect people to services if we understand what's available in the community, what the capacity of those providers are, and how appropriate their scope of services are to the people that we want to reach. So hopefully that is just a little bit of clarification about what we're talking about. And once again, this can be done in any number of ways, and we have some really great examples of how it's been performed in Los Angeles County and in Detroit. So thanks very much for listening to me, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to our presenters for the day. Thanks again.
Thank you, Chris. Next up, we have Vanessa from McGregor Fund.
Thanks, Betty. Hi, everybody. I'm Vanessa Sumanelson. My pronouns are she and her, and it's great to be with you today. I'd like to thank Heartland Alliance for this webinar. It's a really great topic. I work at the McGregor Fund, which is located in Detroit. It's an independent foundation, and I am the Director of Learning and Reporting there. Our grant making focuses on people experiencing poverty in Detroit and the surrounding counties. The McGregor Fund grants about $7 million a year. Overall, our grant making priorities, which you see here, are intended to represent an integrated social safety net. Our support for efforts to end homelessness are in the basic needs and housing grant making priority that you see in orange. And our support for efforts that connect people to employment are in the skill building and employment category, all the way over to the right. The asset mapping work that I'm going to talk with you about today was really grounded in the skill building and employment grant making priority, which was brand new for us when we started the project that I'm going to share with you today. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, employment was a really new field of work for us when we began this, and we had a lot to learn. And so one of the primary purposes of this work was really to expedite our learning about a new area of grant making that we were entering. It was initially primarily intended to be used for our internal use, and then to be able to be used to engage stakeholders externally. And as we had been getting to know the employment space a little bit, we had often heard about people facing barriers to employment, and that housing instability and homelessness was one of the biggest barriers to connection to employment. So we really decided to focus this report on job seekers who were facing multiple barriers to employment, and really wanted to understand for them how Detroit's workforce system was organized to meet their needs, how individual providers, workforce providers, were able to support them, and then what the opportunities were to better serve them as they looked to connect to employment. So we began working on this. This officially kicked off in summer of 2017. Next slide, please. So the scope of our asset mapping project was workforce system-wide. We really wanted to get a broad understanding and lay of the land of how the workforce system was functioning for this population. And we wanted to know a lot of different things. We wanted to know about programmatic approaches that were known to work. And so part of this project was a literature review. We wanted to understand the approaches and assets and insights that providers had in working with this population. And so part of this project included individual interviews with providers and system leaders, as well as focus groups, and then looking at that thematically. We really wanted to understand one of the major assets in the system, which was the funding, the public funding specifically. And so there was a public funding analysis that was part of this. And then we wanted to understand the connections between organizations and the referral patterns across organizations. And so the last part of this was a workforce network analysis. I think just sort of to sum up the approach, I think as newbies to workforce, the workforce system and employment programs generally, we were trying to document and make visible some of the dynamics that we kept hearing about anecdotally that really related to a population that was really aligned with our mission. Next slide, please. So initially this began as an internal learning project, as I said. To do it, we made a grant to an organization in Michigan called the Workforce Intelligence Network to really execute the project. As we were getting going, we learned that Detroit's workforce system was also beginning their own comprehensive information gathering process. And that process was going to be pretty intensive in terms of time asked of providers and workforce stakeholders. And so in coordination with our partners in the workforce system, we slowed our asset mapping project down to make sure that we were coordinating information gathering efforts and sharing information to reduce the burden of time that we were collectively requesting from workforce providers. I think that that adjustment, so it was originally supposed to be about a year-long project. It ended up taking 2 years, but I think that adjustment was really critical for this project because it meant that workforce system leaders and partners were in the room and got to hear the responses to the questions that were being asked as part of our project at the same time that they were gathering their own information. As well as, it facilitated a good amount of partnership work with the workforce system over time as we really worked to coordinate these efforts. So 2 years later, we had a number of projects that were, or products, that were summarized in a final report. Next slide, please. This is the cover of the report. I think we have a link that we can share with everybody if you're interested in reading through it. The report itself is a pretty quick read, and then it's got some pretty meaty appendices near the back. Next slide, please. So I'll share just a little bit about what we learned from the project. I'll give you some examples of the kinds of information that we used to visualize the assets that were mapped, and then I'll offer a little bit of reflection. So these might not be a surprise to anybody on the call, but one of the things that we learned was that multiple barriers to work are the most detrimental to employment outcomes. So the more barriers a job seeker faces, the harder it is to be employed and to stay employed. We learned that the barriers that job seekers were coming to the workforce system with really extended beyond the traditional scope of workforce development activities. And we also learned from the literature review that removing barriers at the same time as connecting to employment is really the most effective. This was really important for us because the dynamic that we were hearing about was that job seekers would come to the employment system with barriers, and there was not enough resources to be able to. So a person coming to the workforce system, maybe experiencing homelessness or housing instability, would like to be connected to work. There were not enough system-held resources to be able to effectively connect somebody to support them in their housing, to resolve their homelessness or housing instability. And so they would be told, you know, we really want to work with you. Please come back when you've stabilized your housing, and then we can work with you. But it's a catch-22, right? Because folks need income to be able to stabilize their housing. It's hard to connect to employment when you don't have stable housing. So this was this catch-22. And so the insight that you really try to figure out how to connect to employment and remove barriers at the same time was important for us. This was something that the fourth bullet is something that Chris was talking to. So we learned the importance of system coordinated referrals, like workforce system coordinated referrals to other systems of care, because they're critical in ensuring continuity of service and reduced fragmentation for job seekers. We learned that individual staff within workforce service providers would hold their own personal referral networks based on their own relationships, based on their own social capital, because they were trying to do everything that they could to connect people who were coming to them with resources. But what this meant was that there was a complete lack of consistency for consumers, and fragmentation. And I'll show you something in a minute that illustrates this a little bit more. And then we learned that requirements of public workforce funding were really limiting the system's capacity to serve this particular population that we were interested in. Next slide, please. So one of the components of this project was a social network analysis, and this is the full map that resulted from the social network analysis. This is we began by engaging the organizations that were serving as the front doors of the workforce system in Detroit. We call them career centers. And so what you'll see in there are dark blue nodes, and you'll notice that they're nodes because they're individual dots with sort of this starburst pattern coming out. Most of those are career centers. And so when you look at this in the 259 odd organizations it represents, you see that different career centers have distinct referral relationships, that they don't necessarily overlap all that much. And so for service providers, it's really interesting to find themselves in the map and see the relationships that are collectively held by their staff. The same thing's true for the system, right? This provides a snapshot of the totality of the referral relationships that the workforce system held, where they're commonly held and where they're not. And then the lighter blue squares are human service organizations. And so being able to get a visual on how many referral relationships existed to other systems of care outside of the workforce system was a really helpful tool as well. Next slide. We did a specific map that spoke to the resources and the referrals that the career centers were using as connection points for people who were disclosing that they were experiencing homelessness or housing instability. And so this more specific map was a really helpful reference point to see which organizations within the homeless response system were connected to the employment system, which weren't, where the connections were held, and then organizations in the map that we didn't expect to see there, but were there. Next slide, please. This is another example of the way that we kind of mapped knowledge assets. And so this is the result from the literature review. We were looking at specific populations within the literature review that we knew were likely facing barriers to employment. They included opportunity youth, returning citizens, recipients of welfare, people with disabilities, and then just general workforce population. And we really wanted to know what was documented in the literature, what did we know about its effect on employment outcomes, and then how strong the level of evidence was to support that effect. And so taking this information into account and the analysis of public funding, a set of recommendations resulted. Next slide, please. Which I'll touch on briefly. The first bullet was just the recommendation and the encouragement to workforce system stakeholders to consider ways to balance funding requirements and performance requirements with best practice. So it was really encouraging our community to say, we understand that there are performance requirements tied to public workforce funding. We also understand that removing barriers at the same time as connection to employment is really effective. Let's think more about how we might be able to do that. There was a recommendation around building better data infrastructure and data collection practices. And this was really particularly to be able to more accurately document and quantify the barriers that job seekers were facing. There was a recommendation to increase coordination at a systems level between the workforce system and other systems of care, particularly the homeless system, as that was really the most prevalent barrier that people were citing as they were coming to the workforce system. Obviously, just more effective referral tracking, and then continued analysis of the limitations of public funding and the restrictions with respect to this particular population. Next slide, please. So this was a 2-year project. We collected data. There was a fair amount of analysis done. There was meaning making done, and we had a final report with these various views into how the workforce system was able to support multiple job seekers facing multiple barriers to work. And I think one of the contributions that this process offered, as well as the final report, was that it really held space and has been a reference point for a continued focus on job seekers facing multiple barriers and the importance of cross-system solutions. At the McGregor Fund, it has helped us identify how a private funder can contribute to removing barriers to employment, as well as how we can think about private funder roles in catalyzing cross-systems work. A lot of this information in the report was foundational that the McGregor Fund used to develop a strategy focused on ending homelessness and chronic unemployment, and the collaboration, the connection between the two. And then I would say that this project was one way that we began to build relationships with employment providers. And part of that is because this project was premised on wanting us to learn about their work and some of the most difficult aspects of their work and their experiences and thoughts in doing that. The report contributed to some shifts out in the homeless system and employment systems as well. It was definitely not the only reason why these shifts were made, but it was a contributor. And so I would say the first is that it set the stage for continued work across our homeless system and employment system to work with the fabulous Heartland Alliance National Initiatives team to build towards more formal cross-systems partnerships between the Detroit Continuum of Care and the workforce system. This process did lift up the absolute and sort of immediate need to have better data and more accurate data on barriers. And so on the employment system side, in consultation and in partnership with homeless stakeholders, they developed new questions on housing instability and homelessness for employment intake. And then the reverse was done on the homeless system side at point of coordinated entry at intake for the homeless system. They incorporated questions on current employment status as well as desire for employment. And then, just overall, I think this work offered a frame of reference across both systems. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the last slide I'll share with you, and I thought I'd just share some reflections about what worked well for this process. I think at the beginning of this project, like many data collection projects, there were questions about, okay, well, what are you going to have at the end, and then what are you going to do with it? What's it going to look like, and then what will it enable us to do with it? And those were really fair questions. And I would also say that for us, and I think for our community, the highest value add from this work was not necessarily the final report, but what was gained and built in the process of doing this work. I think if we had begun saying, like, if we had started this work framing it as an asset mapping project, it would have been very different. And it would have resulted in a set of expectations, I think, and emphasis on the final product, not the process. And I think it would have narrowed the kind of engagement we had with stakeholders, which we really needed to get a full lay of the land and appreciate what they were facing. I think that part of the reason this project worked well was that it was done with the intent to learn. It wasn't done with the intent, like the explicit intent to map, it was done with the intention to learn, which I think helped shift dynamics in the room, really explore all of the dynamics at play with respect to job seekers facing multiple barriers to work. I think the fact that we focused this work on a population instead of programs really helped identify shared interest across systems, and particularly across the homelessness system and the employment system. Part of what made stakeholders so interested and willing to engage in this process was that it was responding to their pain points. It was responding to work where they felt they weren't necessarily doing the kind of job that they wanted to be able to do, but that success of serving those job seekers was really out of their direct control. And so the more we got into the interviews and focus groups, the more people could see how a cross-systems approach was really necessary. And then I think the components of the project were really helpful. I think including service providers within the broader public funding context, within the broader referral context, really helped just norm that there are many dimensions that go into serving this population well, and that it's complex. I'll just close by saying that if we were in your shoes, and if we were going to start this project now or start planning it now, rather than scoping it out back in 2016, I think everything that I've shared with you would still hold true, and I'd still proceed with. I would add a few things. I would add an explicit lens for equity and justice for the BIPOC and LGBTQ communities. That would be central. We would have engagement. We would plan for engagement with people with lived experience directly as part of stakeholder engagement, and meaning making from the information that came back and development of the recommendations. And I think that we might have considered more integration across interviews and focus groups to promote real-time learning and exchange. So this goes back to my point that a lot of the value from this was the process of doing it and not necessarily the final report. Some of these focus groups for people who worked at workforce agencies, when they were gathered together, for some of them, this was the first time they'd had a conversation as a staff about the challenges they faced and the resources they used to connect these job seekers to resources and to employment. And so there was a lot of real-time sharing and learning and perspective development together in those conversations. And so I think it would be interesting to think about how you're also promoting that across systems as you're going, and across agencies. So that's what I have to share with you today. I look forward to your questions later on if you have them. And I'll turn it back to Betty. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Vanessa. That was so informative and awesome. Next up, we have Dara Papel-Weinger and Irene Vidianti from Los Angeles County.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. My name is Dara Papel-Weinger, pronouns are she, hers, and I'm a senior program manager for Corporation for Supportive Housing, or CSH, in Los Angeles. CSH is a national nonprofit organization, and we work to support and expand supportive housing and homeless systems transformation. And we do that through lending, through policymaking, and training and technical assistance. I'm presenting alongside Irene Vidianti, who's a senior data analyst for the County of Los Angeles Chief Information Office, to talk through our asset mapping process with LA County's Employment and Homelessness Task Force. So in early 2018, Los Angeles County Chief Executive Office's Homeless Initiative Department, it's a department that oversees a revenue source that's dedicated for services and supports across Los Angeles County, specifically to address homelessness. The Homeless Initiative convenes systems leaders from LA County Workforce Development Board, from our Department of Public Social Services, which is the department that delivers TANF and General Relief and SNAP and Medi-Cal, as well as our Continuum of Care lead, which is LAHSA, or Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority. And CSH helped to support and facilitate these regular convenings to address a major gap that we were seeing in services. These leaders across these systems, public workforce, public benefits, homeless services, they acknowledged that three key things, that individuals who are experiencing or at risk of experiencing homelessness, they want to work and have skills and abilities to be able to bring to the workforce. The second is that the county has many different employment programs that can be leveraged and coordinated to maximize meaningful employment for people who are experiencing and exiting out of homelessness. And then we wanted to go through a 12-month process to understand the significant culture shifts that were needed by system partners in order to create easy access to employment for people who are experiencing homelessness. So the Employment and Homelessness Task Force had three main objectives. The first one was to increase the capacity of these three major systems, which was workforce development. That also included education and training, public social services, which, like I said, was the benefits providers, and the homeless services system. By increasing the capacity of those systems, the goal was to connect people experiencing homelessness or at risk of, or even recently have exited out of homelessness, and connecting them to employment. The second goal was to improve communication and collaboration between these three systems and improve their ability to effectively serve people who are experiencing homelessness. And the third goal was to reduce barriers to employment for individuals experiencing homelessness. And we started off focusing on folks who were in rapid rehousing programs who would need to sustain their rent payments beyond the terms of their subsidies. We recognized we weren't going to be doing any good for the folks who were entering into housing with supports if they were just going to be exiting back into homelessness if they couldn't afford their rent payments. So that was where it started. So now I'll talk about the process of this cross-sector collaboration. So you see, it was a multi-step process. The LA County Employment and Homelessness Task Force with CSH's technical assistance support. underwent a year-long process to unpack that gap between homeless services, public benefits, and public workforce systems, to provide solutions and help support, bridge the divide, and identify opportunities for coordination. So first, we identified the key leaders of the Employment and Homelessness Task Force, and had went through sort of a process flow or operational flow for people who are going through each of these systems programs. And we got a sense of what were the big question marks that we didn't have answers to. And so we identified as data, those as our data needs. Then we interviewed a really large swath of cross-sector stakeholders. I think there were over 35 interviews, including employment service providers, homeless service agencies, workforce agencies, benefits providers, people with lived experience of navigating these systems. We really had a nice cross-section. And that input from the stakeholders ultimately helped to shape some recommendations. But before recommendations were created, we also wanted to do, like Vanessa did, it was a literature review. So we collected research from other communities with best and promising practices for income and employment alignment. Then we developed these recommendations, and with that came some rationale, which had some of the background information that we collected from stakeholder interviews and learnings from other communities. And we identified pilot regions. In those 2 pilot regions, which I'll talk about in a moment, we conducted design sessions with community partners who were in the field and across sectors to provide guidance on how to actualize those recommendations. This is where we leaned on the expertise and partnership with Heartland Alliance, as they helped to co-facilitate these design sessions with us. Then we did our asset mapping and looked at process improvements and streamlined referral opportunities. And Irene's going to talk about that much more deeply. But then afterwards, the idea of this process flow is to then take the learnings from the design sessions and the asset mapping and put it into play and implement. We set out to implement the work that was done and designed in those pilot regions. And we did that also with the support and guidance from the United Way of Greater Los Angeles, which helped to lead a 100-day challenge with rapid rehousing participants to help connect 100 rapid rehousing participants to 100 jobs in 100 days, and then measure retention efforts as well. And then we wanted to, our final step was support for lasting and effective systems, leadership, and action. So that was quality assurance and accountability to really look at what support for lasting action could look like and needs to look like in Los Angeles County. And COVID hit, and so it skewed some of the work that we had to do. We can go to the next slide. I'm not going to go into the details of our starting point, but you get to see how complex it is for someone who's experiencing homelessness to navigate through to different jobs. They have to go through multiple systems, and the pathways are really sort of convoluted and multi-directional and multifaceted. So we wanted to, this was a result of some of that initial process flow that we did with the Employment and Homelessness Task Force leaders. So let's head over to the next slide. If that was our starting point, this is our goal, which is a lot simpler. The Employment and Homelessness Task Force set out to simplify how folks experiencing homelessness are engaged in workforce activities and how they're supported to meet their employment goals in 2 regional pilot areas, or what we called regional clusters. Those were in South Los Angeles and San Gabriel Valley. The task force recognized that each geographic region has different processes, different partnerships, different job opportunities and job markets, and resources that were unique to those areas. So it was really important to understand how each region's partnerships work and what doesn't when it comes to that intersection of employment and housing. So we wanted to take the four sectors of community, college and adult education, the homeless services sector, public social services, and public workforce partners, bring them all together, folks who were on the ground, look at what are some questions that we should be asking that maybe we aren't. How can we match, identify maybe existing programs and services packages based on someone's needs and someone's interests and someone's goals. Look at what referrals should be in those regions to reduce those barriers to connecting someone, a homeless job seeker, with a job, and then navigating. So what are some of the supports that might be needed? We can go to the next slide, please. So in each of the clusters, this is just a smattering of some of the cross-departmental and cross-system representatives who were present in both San Gabriel Valley and South Los Angeles pilot regions or clusters. The clusters were identified through geographic boundaries around the Department of Public Social Services district offices. We looked at what relationships, cross-partner relationships, existed in those within those regions, because there are 14 district offices for DPSS in Los Angeles County versus 8 service planning areas in the homeless services sector, whereas the AJC, or the public workforce system, has, I think, 57 district offices. So we were trying to right size, and we identified that sort of looking at it from the DPSS office was going to be the best way to go. All right, next slide, please. The Employment and Homelessness Task Force projected that there would be some four components of employment and homelessness systems integration that we needed to help partners in these 2 clusters. We needed their help to identify what works and what doesn't for job seekers experiencing homelessness and who are touching each of those systems. So these were some of the components, and I can talk about them a little bit later, but I know that the meat of what we want to talk about is coming from Irene Vigianti from LA County CIO, the Chief Information Office, to really talk and share about the asset mapping process. So I'm going to turn it over to Irene.
Thank you so much, Dara. My name is Irene Vigianti, and I am with the County of Los Angeles with the Chief Executive Office, more specifically within the Chief Information Office. I'm a senior analyst and data scientist there. So as Dara has mentioned, the asset mapping process that we went through in LA County is really one component of a larger body of work around this homeless employment system task force. But it is a pretty critical component. And we did this for 2 regions that Dara has mentioned, South LA and San Gabriel Valley, sort of as a pilot for the larger LA community. And we did this entire asset mapping process that I'm going to talk through from ideation until finish in 6 months, which is a very aggressive timeline. And at the end of my presentation, I'm going to talk about why that's not advisable. So next slide, please, Betty. So first, I'll start by just giving a brief overview of the phases and the steps that we went through in this asset mapping process. So we took a bottoms-up approach in our asset mapping approach in these two communities. So we started by looking at the individual agencies that are within the homeless and employment system within that community, talk to each individual agency, map out their processes and how they're connected to one another based on their informal and formal relationships with one another. And then we synthesize all that information into a network map to really visualize what the relationships throughout the community in that cluster looks like. So our first phase, the sort of like the bottom in the bottoms-up approach, is the process mapping phase. So here we started by having a sort of pilot with just one individual agency in this process mapping, because a lot of agencies are not familiar with this process. So we decided we're going to start with one pilot agency that we work with to come up with a process map for them that we can use as a sample for the other agencies that we work with within that region. And the first step that we did in this process mapping is creating workflow narratives with the agencies or providers within that community to identify what's their flow like from the point of getting clients into their provider agency, having assessments, providing services, as well as connecting them with other agencies if necessary. Based on that information gathered, we then create the process maps that reflect this current processes, and then we validated this maps back with the individual agencies to make sure that we captured the information correctly. If not, then we revise the maps. And then we convened the agencies within each region to refine this process maps. So we had a workshop to identify, are there processes and linkages that we can newly form or improve or streamline based on this current process maps? Should we actually be identifying or assessing needs earlier on in the process? Are there any referrals that we probably should have made, that aren't being made currently? So this all make up the first phase of our process. Next slide, please. And then, as I mentioned, we took this bottoms-up approach based on all those information that we gathered in that first phase. We synthesized the information into a network map as well as a provider roster based on the process maps and narratives that we gathered in the first phase. So we have a visual map of existing relationships between providers in the region. And we also have a roster of provider with the populations they serve, the services that they provide. So these are kind of similar to what Vanessa also has shown. And then the next phase for us was to start kind of bridging this to action. So we explore hypothetical models that could simplify the referral network. So, like seeing the current network map, which is actually fairly complicated even for a relatively small community. What are hypothetical models that can streamline this referral network? And then in phase 3, the step 6 that we have here, we convened the group again, the stakeholders, and we discussed potential referral network models that may simplify the referral process that might work for that particular region. So, it's a step towards turning hypothetical models into reality with the information that we have collected throughout the asset mapping process. So, how do we redesign the referral model informed by the resources that we have gathered in this process to streamline referrals and better serve clients, moving them closer to the goal of ensuring that every homeless job seeker receives the employment supports that they want and need. Next slide, please. So I'm going to walk through each of those steps that I've outlined before in more detail. So as I mentioned before, before we started this whole process, we know that this is going to be something that is new to most, if not all, of the provider agencies that are in the regions that that we were doing this asset mapping process in. So we wanted to do some sort of pilot before we started. So to facilitate this process, we worked with one provider agency to produce a process narrative, have an interview with them to walk through what their processes are like, and then we produce a process map for that agency to serve as samples for the remaining agencies. So when we go to the next steps, we can actually talk the other agencies through the process that we went through with this pilot agency, as well as a sample process map that we have here. Next slide, sorry. So the next step we did was to collect information from all the provider agencies in that region. So for every agency that serves homeless job seekers, we gathered information about their current client flow and processes. So we have a narrative template that you see a snippet of here. And we asked agencies to describe their current client flow for homeless job seekers. And we also bolstered that by having individual interviews with one or more individuals within the provider agencies to just clarify information, talk through what they wrote, and in most cases we ended up having a much richer set of information after those interviews and understanding a bit more about their processes. Next slide. And then based on those narratives and phone interviews, we translated that information into process maps that reflect the current client flows among the homelessness, employment, and public benefit sectors. And we sent back this process maps to the agencies for validation, and then we revised them based on feedback to reflect the true processes that they go through. And one feedback that we heard from the participating agencies is that even at this fairly early stage of the asset mapping process, they actually found this being quite useful to also for them to come up with a document of what their processes are like, and they could already start seeing where they could post their connections or streamline things, as well as you know, having a better understanding, especially for agencies that are larger, to see how their various sort of like smaller agencies within the larger agencies interact. Next slide. And then we gathered the provider agencies within that within each region to identify how we can improve the processes and linkages that that will serve their clients better. So we, in the convening, we actually printed out large poster size process flows and put them up on the walls. And during the workshop, we asked agencies to walk through not just their own process flows to identify how can we improve processes and linkages. You know, like in particular, we asked the agencies, can we identify if there are ways to improve or streamline referrals, but also assessments of needs, because we found out that for many agencies, the assessments are really done sometimes more thoroughly only on the services that the primary services that an agency provides. So for instance, a behavioral health provider will obviously assess for mental health or substance use needs, for instance, but they might not surface that the client might have employment or housing needs unless the client actually self-reports that without prompting, for instance. So, we also ask our provider agencies to identify opportunities to identify those needs, because obviously without identifying those needs, the clients won't be able to be connected to the right services and remove the barriers that they have. So we then ask the agencies to identify themes based on what they have seen in the process maps, and incorporate the feedback from the workshop into sort of the potential improved process maps for each agency, like with the more streamlined referrals, but maybe more points for assessments, as well as additional referrals that are not in the current process maps. Next slide. And then the next phase, as I mentioned, we synthesize those individual process maps that already identified the various referrals into this network map. So the network map that you see here is a sample of the network map that we came up with for one of the regions that we did this asset mapping in. So this visually maps the existing relationships between providers in the community that show the current referral landscape. And the lines show connections between two service providers that have a referral connection, whether formal or informal. And the arrows indicate the direction in which referrals can be made. So we convened the providers again, and we showed this completed network map for that community. And stakeholders could already see the complexity of the referral landscape and the many steps that job seekers often must navigate to be able to remove barriers and receive the services that they are seeking. So particularly for homeless job seekers, this complexity in navigating the referral process and attempting to get to the right provider can result in poor outcomes. We actually had an interactive map there at the convening showing, well, if a client starts, let's say at this point, and this person needs, this person has multiple barriers, behavioral health and employment, of course, but also housing, like more training. Oftentimes this client has to sort of like ping pong between multiple providers before getting all the services that they need. And, obviously that's very challenging, especially since many of the providers don't necessarily serve everyone in a sense that the funding are often restricted for a certain kind of population. There are certain eligibility criteria. So in this experience, we heard feedback from the providers that, yeah, anecdotally, they also felt that the referral landscape is extremely complicated. And, I think one thing that struck me is that many of the providers said, if it is that complicated for us who are supposed to be the service navigators, can you imagine having to navigate this referral landscape, when you're someone who is a homeless job seeker? It's not, like it seems like you're destined for failure. And that's something that we are trying to improve by streamlining the referral network. So, that's really that third step. Our stakeholders share their own experiences and insights about helping job seekers navigate the network and just the complexity of it. And I think it's really good for them to see the network map for their region because it really hammers home, like the things that they experience, like the anecdotes that surfaced during this convening, that is just really complicated to navigate the current referral landscape. Next slide, please. So one other document that we also produce in this asset mapping process that also is derived from the process maps is this network roster of providers. So we have a roster of the providers within the region with their primary area of service. Many of them provide services in more than just their primary area of service, but also other categories of services. And most of them, as I mentioned, serve a specific population, whether it's youth or adults only, or certain specific populations. So that also complicates the referral landscape even more. Next step, please. And then finally, in this last phase, we wanted to, as I mentioned, not just asset map for the sake of asset mapping, but we really want to try to take the next step towards turning them into reality. So now that we have seen what we have seen, first we wanted to explore hypothetical models that would simplify and streamline the referral network. We facilitated a discussion with the stakeholders within the convening, comparing and contrasting hypothetical referral network models that you see here. So the current referral landscape really resembles this so-called point-to-point model, where if a client starts, let's say in this in the green dot that you see, they often and they have multiple barriers and therefore multiple services that they need to be connected to. They often have to sort of ping pong, from one provider to the next until they get all the services that they need. In contrast, we also talk about the hub and spoke model, where we have the same number of providers as in the point-to-point model, but in this case we have a hub here where the referral process becomes a lot more streamlined, because like a client that starts in the green dot there, instead of going through multiple layers of providers before finally getting to the provider that can serve their need, they just have to go to the hub, and then the hub will refer them to sort of the final destination that they need. So the hub and spokes model offer a more streamlined approach in which every provider refers to a central hub that connects all providers in the network, and stakeholders at the convening were able to see how the job seekers could be better served by this type of model compared to the existing point-to-point model. Next slide, please. And then we discussed potential designs of what the streamlined referral network models that could work for that particular region could be. So we start asking the questions and having the discussion with our stakeholders and agencies in terms of how do we design and implement referral networks that are more coordinated and effective, that are more streamlined, that would work for the community based on all the community assets that we have collected the information on. So we had the stakeholders break out into smaller groups to discuss what it would look like to move to a hub and spokes model, what form the hub should take, which provider might work as a suitable hub, and we actually presented several potential options for that, such as picking an existing agency that is currently already well connected based on that network map to be a hub because it's already well positioned to be, or creating a new function, whether it's virtual or otherwise, to be a super navigator to serve the hub, or picking an existing agency that offers the broadest range of services and has the highest capacity, so that when a client goes to the hub, they can also get their needs immediately served, or potentially providing potentially making a hub where there are co-locations of several agencies together so as to offer a broad range of services at the hub. So to aid that discussion, we also provided the stakeholders the roster of providers that you saw in the last two slides that listed what services and are offered by each provider organization, what populations are served, so we can make a more informed decision in terms of what makes sense for that particular region. So after the breakout group, the stakeholders come up with one or several options and models for how the community could be better served through a hub and spoke model, and what it might look like for the community based on the community assets that exist. Next slide. So some takeaways here. I think we found a lot of the same takeaways and highlights and lessons learned that Vanessa also already mentioned. So we did have some useful community level reference materials about the existing and potential referral landscape, but I think the processes are also really important and an important outcome of this whole asset mapping process as well. We found that this asset mapping process itself, as well as the resources, can facilitate deeper insights about what the existing referral landscape for a particular community is like, and that really helps stakeholders envision what improved referral processes and pathways and network can look like, and and design and implement them in their communities. So some lessons that we have learned include planning for and implementing a community-driven approach, making sure that stakeholders understand how the contributions to the process will serve to improve processes and access to resources for the people that they serve. And as Vanessa has mentioned, we also focus on the population, in this case, homeless job seekers, rather than looking at specific programs. And we wanted to also highlight that we included staff from all levels within provider organizations to be able to accurately do the asset mapping, because I think what we have found is that different people from different levels of the organization sometimes have different ideas of what's really going on in the ground. So, like for instance, a provider might have a memorandum of understanding or agreement with another provider in terms of referrals, but in practice, that provider agency might not actually refer to the other provider agency for whatever reason. And finally, to budget ample time for the process. As I mentioned, we went through this whole asset mapping process in just 6 months, which we somehow managed to do, but I would really advise budgeting a lot more time than that. And now I will hand it back to Dara to just go through, when all of this is said and done, how will we know if we meet our goals and whether we're doing well? Dara?
Thanks, Irene. I'm going to go through this really quickly. These goals evolved through the cluster design sessions and were slated to get more targeted as we went through that asset mapping process that Irene led us through. And part of that was really identifying each region's unique needs and referral pathways. So based on these design sessions, we learned that the regional relationships are key, which probably is no surprise, and we've heard it from both Vanessa and Irene. The asset mapping with Irene and the design sessions with Heartland Alliance, we all got these partners in the room, physically in the room, obviously pre-COVID, and that really helped to acquaint each other, acquaint each of the providers, the cross-sector partners with each other and with other programs that maybe they weren't familiar with, and really self-identify those referral opportunities. We'll go to the next slide. And as we mentioned before, COVID hit right when we started our implementation phase, which interrupted the scope and reach of job placement and job retention. We saw that people of color and vulnerable populations, like those who are experiencing or at risk of homelessness, those were the folks who held the riskiest jobs and were at the highest risk of losing their jobs during the health crisis. So what ended up happening is that we used this COVID crisis to look for opportunities for upskilling job seekers, so leaning on workforce development resources and community college resources, and connect folks who were in COVID recovery housing programs to employment supports by asking employment questions in assessment tools, just as a pilot, as a trial basis. Our Continuum of Care lead, LAHSA, Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, they just recently launched a pilot to try out this hub and spoke model with employment specialists who are embedded in homeless service providers so that they could work directly with clients in recovery rehousing programs to help connect them to meet their employment needs and employment goals. As also part of that pilot, there are regional employment liaisons who focus more on those regional relationships and are really more of that outward facing, the hub for understanding what's happening programmatically across the systems instead of working directly with the clients. And really just leaning on the partnerships that were previously developed in these cluster design sessions. So that is all from me. Thank you so much again for having us here today.
Thank you so much, Dara and Irene, and to Vanessa as well. That was super informative and so great. I hope everyone else also had found this interesting. I'm going to pass it now along to Heidi Schulteis, who is our Senior Field Building Project Manager, and she'll take us through some resources and then also take us through the Q&A session.
Great, thanks, Betty. So yeah, I'm going to really quickly go through some resources because I want to get to the Q&A as quickly as we can. So someone had asked for the report that Vanessa mentioned when she was speaking. You can see that on the left side of your screen. And then on the right side of your screen is the resource that we put together and we put out in December of last year. It does not go into as much detail, of course, as Irene did today, but it does include some visuals that I think are really helpful in like figuring out sort of how to lay things out in a way that people can literally see them and make sense of them. So I encourage you to check that out if you haven't. I also just really want to quickly note resources, slides, and a recording are going to be emailed out to everyone in 1 week. So just know that that email is coming. It's just not going to be today or tomorrow. It'll be a week from now. Next slide, Betty. Okay, great. So I just want to direct you to also the toolkits that we have available on our website, papers as well as toolkits, obviously including the asset mapping resource we put out. And please feel free to contact us too if you are looking for a certain thing on our website and not seeing it. We're always happy to help you find what you're looking for. Next slide. Okay, and this is just Chris and me. Again, really, please feel free to contact us. We're really happy to hear from folks. We regularly have just kind of one-off conversations. Sometimes that turns into like a short engagement. It can turn into a longer engagement. So please don't hesitate to reach out. We're always happy to help. I'm just going through this as quickly as possible to get to the Q&A. And here we go. And I can see some people are putting more questions. Sorry, I'm just trying to read a question right now. Okay. So I wanted to ask, you know, how do you think for a community where maybe there's some kind of conversation, I want to ask the panelists, in a community where there's kind of some conversation between homeless services providers and workforce providers or the lead agencies but they haven't undertaken anything like an asset mapping process. There's not been any kind of normalized or formalized relationship between the two. How would you start to build buy-in for both of those systems to participate in a process like the one we've talked about today?
I don't know if it's directed at anyone in particular, but I can take a stab at it.
Any of you? Yeah.
Okay. I would say that it takes, I don't know what community the question asker's coming from, but the fact that the homeless service, two systems are starting to talk to one another is really, that's sort of how it starts. And having those two system leaders having some political will and power and influence to say, hey, there's a disconnect is, I think, the first step. Because then there's the, there's policy and process and programs that can follow suit once you identify that there's a gap. So it's wonderful that the two systems are starting to talk. It's about finding maybe having a third party like Heartland Alliance who could come in and help to guide those conversations once there's sort of consensus that, yeah, hey, there are some major barriers for people experiencing homelessness in connecting to jobs.
Mm-hmm. I guess the sort of natural follow-on to that question, I appreciate that answer, Dara. The follow-on to that question is that, for a community where those two systems are really not in conversation, which is the most common scenario, that these systems just operate in silos, unfortunately. So for folks in communities where there isn't that, budding relationship between the two, do you think an asset mapping process would be possible? And if so, how would you start to go about that?
Maybe I'll just add to what Dara has said just now. So yeah, I think having that sort of facilitator who has some sort of pull within that community, I think is really important. So in our case, we brought together the CEO Homeless Initiatives, CSH and Heartland Alliance, and I think also having funders in the room, I think definitely is a big incentive for people to participate and bring systems together if need be. Really, I think it's probably no surprise that the key in this whole process is buy-in, relationship building, and all that, and obviously having sort of like a lead agency that has some pull, whether it's through funding or it's just a respect that the organization within that community is going to go a long way.
I would also add that, at least from the examples here today, these approaches were pretty time intensive and resource intensive as well. And so one of the things that really made a difference in strengthening relationships and understanding the possibility for connection across the homeless and employment systems was when our coordinated entry system started collecting data on employment, because it started to shift perspectives around connection to employment for people who were experiencing homelessness. So there were a good proportion of people who were coming to the front door of the homelessness system who had been employed within the last 6 months. And once that data started to be talked about, particularly with workforce partners, I think it just broadened the window of opportunity to do more cross-systems work.
Dara, did you want to add anything?
No, asking the questions is we're still working on that over here in Los Angeles, asking the right questions.
I didn't know if you wanted to add.
Yeah.
I didn't want to ask the next question before I gave you a
thanks.
chance to say something. So one thing that I feel like is important to ask too is that, you know, LA County has 10 million people in it, and resources that are in many ways, you know, proportional to that size of population. And Detroit is a large city and has resources that are, you know, appropriate, one could argue, for that size of city. I'm curious about for folks who don't have an Irene and who don't have a McGregor or a Vanessa and who don't have a Dara, you know, smaller, much smaller communities with more limited resources. What would you say they need to know about this process?
Well, I think maybe first I'll kind of give a prologue by saying that you know, like, even though LA County is obviously you know, a really large jurisdiction, we did this asset mapping process for two, you know, fairly small communities within LA County rather than for the entirety of LA County, because even for us, I think we realize it's probably a fool's errand to, you know, start right away with tackling the entirety of LA County, which is the sprawling big jurisdiction. And as Dara has said, there's also a lot of regions that have very different characteristics, you know, that we should also take into account. So, you know, like, maybe that's probably heartening for the smaller jurisdictions who are thinking about tackling something like this, that, you know, we were able to do it in two smaller communities in LA County, you know, that serve a relatively small number of people, you know, not 10 million people for sure. But secondly, I think I would say that, you know, like, I think what we did, you don't have to do the entirety of the asset mapping process that we did. I think there are definitely some phases that might work better for you, depending on sort of the goal that you are that you're interested in. I think for us, as I mentioned before, we did the bottoms-up approach, or we have a deep dive into each agency's processes, and then we built a network map, and then, you know, like a sort of like when through, you know, like, based on all this, what's a model that could work to streamline these processes. But I mean, it's for us, I think that works because that serves the goal of what the questions that we are trying to answer. But some other communities that are interested in this might just be interested in, you know, like the connection between systems without really looking into the processes, because the processes might be a lot simpler than what some of the agencies that we are, you know, looking at have. You know, like, they might come up with just you know, a roster of providers and services, and, you know, and I think that might be sort of like a low tech way to do this asset mapping, and you know, like, already have like a pretty good baseline in terms of, you know, this is what we have within this community. And, you know, like, if we have a client that comes to us with you know, like, with this kind of need, and, you know, like, is this kind of population, then, you know, we can get this client to this agency, you know, and then that roster or provider in a smaller community probably wouldn't look too intimidating. You know, you wouldn't have 2,000 agencies within the roster, so, you know, hopefully it's going to be in an inventory that will be easier for people to navigate. Not to mention that it will also serve to highlight gaps in the system. You know, if looking at the roster of providers, we realize, well, you know, there's really no one who is serving, let's say, you know, like adults coming out of the justice system who needs legal services to get their convictions sealed, for instance, so that they can get jobs. You know, like, I think you know, that that roster of providers and the services and the population served that we created I think that could be like a sort of like a baseline and a start for a smaller community to tackle.
I also loved, I mean, I think if there's already shared interest across systems, then like the portion of the process that my colleagues in LA were talking about mapping out a person's experience just seems like a wonderful place to start. It doesn't have to be super high tech. It doesn't, you know, it doesn't have to be a gigantic process, but it's a real way of grounding folks in what is, you know, in some of the fragmentation and the need for cross systems work. I would say that if there isn't shared understanding and shared buy-in about why this is important, I think that like just it's really important to find the populations that the systems have in common and start there, because chances are they need each other and they're having a hard time, right, serving those clients effectively. And so it's natural to want to have conversations about areas where folks are could use more help.
And I would just quickly add, if that's okay. I think not only asking the system leaders of what the process flow is, but finding also people who directly navigated the systems, what their experiences are, is a really important catalyst because they'll tell you exactly what's broken and what needs to be fixed. So that's a really easy way to engage.
Absolutely, yeah. I like these quote unquote low tech recommendations too, and like breaking this into parts that if all you can do is one or two aspects of it, that finished product might still be useful on its own, and it can spark conversation and relationship building that could lead to just greater levels of collaboration generally. So I realize we are at time today. Wish we'd had even more time for Q&A with everyone, but I want to really thank Irene and Dara and Vanessa sincerely for all the time they put into preparing for this, for working with us, for showing up today and doing an amazing job. Betty has put in the chat a link to a survey that it would be great if you could fill out. And just a reminder that the recording and slides are actually going to be available on our website, and we're going to email those out in a week. Thank you so much for staying with us even over our time a little bit, and I'll just ask Betty to give any last words she may have.
Nope, thank you all for joining, and we'll see you again soon.